think maybe we could begin, if that's okay. There'll be a few more people coming, but that's okay. So hello, everyone. Welcome to this wonderful book launch. Just to let everyone know before I say anything, this is being recorded. So if you do not want to be recorded, please turn off your camera. So today I would like to present The Feeling of History, Islam, Romanticism, and Andalusia by Charles Hirschkind, who we have with us today. It's published by University of Chicago Press. So I'm Flora Hastings, and I'm part of the Jewish Muslim Research Network. And the co-organizer Addy will be posting a link to our upcoming events in the chat if you would like to follow that. So just for the order of events, I'm going to be asking Charles questions about his book for about 30 minutes, and then we'll be taking questions from you guys. So please either write your question in the chat or raise your hand, and we'll come to you alternatively. So just to briefly introduce myself, I'm a PhD student at SOAS's anthropology department. So my research is on the other side of Spain, in Barcelona, other side from Andalusia. And I'm looking at public forms of Jewish identity in a cultural center, and specifically focusing on leftist Jewish and Catalan politics and the formation of social memory in public space. And before moving on to Hirschkind's book, I would like to just introduce him briefly. So Hirschkind is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of California, Berkeley. His research has explored religious practice, media technologies, and emergent forms of political community in the Middle East, North America, and Europe. His first book, titled The Ethical Soundscape, Cassette Sermons and Islamic Counterpublics, explores how a popular Islamic media form has transformed the political geography of the Middle East. As we will discuss, Charles Hirschkind's research has moved to southern Spain more recently. Okay, so now to get onto The Feeling of History, I love the cover. So I thought, Charles, if you would like to just introduce everyone to your book, you could talk about the main focus of The Feeling of History and what led you to begin research on this book.
I'm just turning my phone down so it doesn't interrupt us. Thank you, Flora, and thanks very much to the other organizers for inviting me here, Adi and Kate. It's really a pleasure to speak here. I'm really looking forward to hearing people's questions and having a chance to speak with others about this recent publication. So, I mean, I had long been sort of interested in debates in Europe about, about the compatibility of Islam with European values, particularly around the time of the headscarf affair and the cartoons affair. There was a lot of debate, or that was the beginning of a debate that later on, took a very prominent role in reshaping European political life, but it had to do with the status of Islam within Europe. And I started sort of formulating the idea that it would be interesting to look at that question from the standpoint of southern Spain, not only southern Spain, but southern Europe more broadly, and that to think about what that question would look like when posed from the sort of unique positionality of southern Europe. So that eventually is what brought me there. I also, one of the preachers I had studied with in Egypt, while I was taking lessons about Islamic preaching in Egypt, in the middle of our work, he had gotten a fellowship to go and study in Spain and to complete a doctoral degree on a medieval form of poetry. And so we'd begun a kind of conversation about this, and years later I met him and spoke with him and learned more about his work, and we ended up actually working with a number of the same people. So there were a few different connections that brought me there. To give you a sort of, a summary view of the book is an exploration of what might be called the afterlife of Muslim Iberia as it exists in present-day Spain. Muslim Iberia being a period that stretches roughly from the 8th to the 15th century. And of the way that that inherited past, which, to a certain extent had been, let's say, repressed or denied within Spanish national culture, is instead mediated and sustained by a modern tradition or a modern counter-historical tradition of Spanish writers and poets, historians, artists, journalists, people who since the end of the 19th century and into the present have cultivated a passionate attachment to this universe of Al-Andalus. They've learned how to listen to it in music and to feel it in art, to mourn its loss. They've honed a capacity to sort of feel and reactivate its presence within modern Spanish life, often as a certain sort of painful breach in the homogeneous texture of Spanish identity and history. So this tradition is known as Andalusismo, which is the sort of central concept in the book. Andalusismo, in a narrow sense, is usually used to refer to a regional nationalist movement in southern Spain that takes off in the early decades of the 20th century. There's also a broader sense that I invoke in the book. It's not just about regional nationalism, but as I understand it and develop it in the book, Andalusismo refers to a modern tradition of critical reflection on the norms of Spanish, but European culture more broadly, European culture and politics, based on this appreciation for the histories and legacies of Southern Iberia's Muslim and Jewish societies. So the sort of foundational principle at the heart of this is that contemporary Andalusia is linked in vitally important ways to Al-Andalus, or medieval Islamic Iberia, and that the challenges faced by Andalusians and by Europeans more broadly in some sense require a recognition of that historical identity. A key sort of dimension of the book has to do with the concept of feeling and sensibility and emotion. So the title of the book, The Feeling of History, I wanted to communicate the idea that the past cannot always be made the object of dispassionate study and reflection, that we sometimes find ourselves bound to the past, to particular regions of the past, through feeling, through emotion, that shape the way we encounter it and the reality that it has in our lives, not by creating a distorted image of it, but by connecting us to it in a passional way. So for the Andalusistas, they are people who feel passionately attached to medieval Iberia, and they live that attachment as a demand on their lives and as a source of insight. So in their view, the strong feelings evoked in them by Al-Andalus, as they encounter it in the landscape of southern Iberia, as they encounter it in their language, in architecture, in art, enable them to grasp aspects of their contemporary world that they would not otherwise see, and allow them, therefore, a kind of critical perspective on the present. So that pretty much covers the basic elements of the book.
Yeah, that was a great introduction, and I feel like we're all being brought into the Andalusismo world. I definitely was as I read the book. I wanted to be in Granada. So I thought we could just move on to some of the kind of theoretical interventions of your book, as I feel like, in the introduction, you say that you felt like to properly understand Andalusismo on its own terms, you had to kind of question dominant scholarly understandings of Romanticism and Orientalism. And you kind of had to reassess how the terms, a romantic or an Orientalist are used often to sort of denounce someone's scholarly or political views or motivations. So first, just to begin with Romanticism. So in your book, you suggest Andalusistas are inheritors of the early 19th century Romantic movement, although, and I quote, not in the way many of those who assert this charge intend. So I just thought you could, first you can outline how you've understood Romanticism to be a valuable critique of modern European intellectual traditions, and how Andalusismo has inherited through its own mediums some of these romantic sensibilities.
So when I started working on this project, the first thing that people would tell me is that, oh, well, that's a romantic movement, and um, and that seemed to indicate that that was pretty much all I needed to know about it. That is, the sense that it belonged to a kind of species of error that was recognizable and could be described through the notion of romanticism. Um, and what struck me as strange about that, of course, is that much of our sort of contemporary theory we think about, or trends in contemporary theoretical trends that we find useful, right, are highly indebted to aspects of romanticism. I think we think about our theories of language. The language is not just a sort of abstract or neutral system whose primary function is to refer to the world, or our critique of liberal ideas of the autonomous subject, um, the various ways in which we have come to see embodiment as essential to the formation of the worlds we inhabit. All of those things seem to me to involve insights that the Romantics developed in various directions and in different ways. If we think of the Romanticism as a critique of what they saw as an impoverished view of human life, of human language, of tradition, of history, that was put forth by many of the sort of rationalist currents of the Enlightenment, well, that's certainly been very influential across a range of contemporary thinkers. All of which is to say, Romanticism, as I saw it, was not the sort of conclusion to an assessment of the tradition, but an invitation to think about, well, what sort of insights did the romantic dimension of this tradition open up for practitioners of it? So one key dimension of it is that they assign what we could call epistemic value to the emotions and to the senses, and or at least, and this is a very dominant trend within Andalusista writing, right? An emphasis on the kind of passional attachment to Al-Andalus, as well as feelings of the cultivation of feelings of melancholy for its loss, and so those sort of call them emotional repertoires are seen not just simply as distortions, or not just simply as introducing subjective features into a historical account, but as opening up the possibility of knowing something fundamental about the past. And so, in that sense, I was reluctant, therefore, to dismiss it as quickly, maybe as many people, I think, have tended to. And so, I do see that, Romanticism, there's been a lot of, work questioning the sort of received judgment about the Romantic, period. In Spain, in particular, Romanticism, because of it has strong echoes of the Civil War, and so it comes with a certain kind of the Romanticism of the kind of the idea that was central to national Catholicism, that Spain had a kind of deep, abiding sense of identity that lay in its sort of universal Catholic mission. That makes people very suspicious, right? Because it's still, the Civil War is not that far off, and so any movement that kind of emphasizes a certain sort of passional attention to attraction or attachment to an abiding past raises considerable skepticism. So that's one of the things that led me to sort of try to think more openly about what were the claims of this movement, and what was the place of emotion and sensibility within it.
And I was going to ask this later, but I'll just ask it now because it seems relevant. Just thinking about the methodology of your own research, being a sort of anthropologist trained in ethnography, to what extent did the kind of epistemic flexibility of ethnography itself help you to research Andalusistas, in the present day, to go and experience these sensibilities in cafes and bars and public space, as well as, reading traditions of Andalusismo through kind of more discursive sources?
Yeah, I hadn't thought of ethnography as being epistemically flexible, but you're probably right, and especially in compared to certain sort of versions of historiography. And I mean, it was interesting. The chapters of the book, as I originally intended them, move from a kind of more historical sections focusing on the early 20th century or late 19th century, with the second half of the chapters, at least as I had conceived of them, being more ethnographic. Turns out, in the end, there's one or two chapters that have a certain ethnographic taste, but I ended up relying quite a bit more on historical narrative, and not just historical narrative, but let's just say the book is not as ethnographically dense as most anthropological writings. And part of it had to do, I think, with um, the kind of sensibility which I see at the heart of Andalusismo is something that is really only sort of reveals itself across the trajectory of a life, right? It's not sort of indicated, it's not sort of evident in particular statements or actions, but one sort of sees it when it's plotted onto a kind of biographical image, and particularly across generations, where one starts to see the sort of patterns emerge. Um, Otherwise, it just seems like recognizable acts of romantic uh, enthusiasm. And so, in that sense, I think the necessity of I found much greater kind of historical narrative much more important than I had originally imagined. Um, but I found, certainly I do not abide by the protocols of secular historiography in my approach to the tradition, and I certainly learned in part through, under the guidance of my informants, to think about the value of sensibility and emotion, um, about sensory engagement, in the way one assesses, responds to historical narrative, um, in the way one responds to different media of historical experience, including music, including art. Um, yeah, I think I would I would leave it at that.
Great, thank you. So just a quick question about your sort of the introduction of your book, and then we'll move on to the chapters. Just you also talk about how in your understanding of Andalusismo, you kind of reassessed how people often use the term Orientalist. Specifically with Andalusistas, people have often discredited them as Orientalists.
Yeah.
And in a footnote in your book, you suggest, and I quote, that you take the tradition of Andalusismo as a necessary reassessment of Orientalism, as opposed to critiquing Andalusismo as a product of Spanish Orientalism. So I thought you could just explore how the denunciation of Andalusismo as Orientalist has reduced the tradition's valuable critique of East-West dichotomies, and explore how Andalusismo may provide a perspective to sort of reassess, for example, Said's influential concept of Orientalism.
Yeah, so I think Said's brilliant analysis has been immensely important and politically of great significance. But what's central to his analysis of Orientalism is that he grasps it in instrumental terms. That is, he grasps it thinking about the way the tradition functions in the service of power, and particularly colonial power, which is certainly, on one hand, it is true and was true and is true, we could say. Um, but he understands that the importance of the tradition is sort of is exhaustively defined right? And the importance of its modes of reflection, imagination, forms of study can be grasped in their totality through this instrumental function. And I think in some ways that's not entirely satisfactory, that there are ways in which, let's say, the forms of imagination proposed, in this case by Andalusistas, the political trajectories they pursue in their own individual lives, the artistic forms they develop, that they cannot quite be plotted on the binary of West and non-West in the way that, which is central to the operations of Orientalism. So Andalusismo played an important role within Spain's colonial ideologies as well. That is, the Franco regime found it quite useful to invoke Andalusismo's sort of idyllic image of a harmonious relation across the Mediterranean, and the concept of a Hispano-Arabic civilization was used as a justification for, the occupation of Morocco as not really a colonial occupation, but a fraternal visitation, by a long lost brother, and so it was used by the regime, right, to justify its own colonial violence. And there's some very interesting writing on that that's, I think, very powerfully shown the way in which Andalusismo played a key sort of role within the colonial ideologies of the Franquismo. At the same time, when you look at the sort of individual biographies, particularly of people who were kind of, let's say, central figures within Andalusismo, you find that those biographies do not quite map onto the projects of colonialism. And a number of those people became actually ardent anti-colonial activists as well. I speak about in the book particularly Rodolfo Gil Benumaya, who spent his entire career working for the Franco regime, and yet became a kind of not only an important supporter of Moroccan nationalism, not just a supporter in the abstract, but a collaborator with the leading nationalist of the period, but also became an important supporter and confidant and interlocutor with the leaders of pan-Islamism, of pan-Arabism. He, dedicated much of his writing to trying to build support in Spain for those movements. And he received recognition in the Middle East as a strong supporter of those, which meant that he frequently found himself at odds with his employers in the Franco regime. And it's the very ambivalence that, of those careers. I think in some ways, like in Benumaya's case, I think he imagined that the kind of state-led project of social transformation that he envisioned, the fascist regime to enable, could bring about what he saw as this new Andalusista world, of which he understood as a Hispano-Arabic world, which entailed, for example, that Spaniards would need to all learn Arabic, that Islam would need to be taught in schools in Spain, things like that. And even when he eventually realized that the state was using his own writings in ways that very much against his intentions, and he criticized the state harshly for that. But they continued to find his writings useful. So there was a difference between, let's say, the way in which his work was instrumentalized and what you see as his commitment to Andalusismo as having taken shape across his life in a whole variety of actions and writings and thoughts and associations that don't map onto this sort of colonial recruitment of the kind that Said emphasizes. I mean, I would just say, Lorca, the Federico Garcia Lorca, the very famous poet, Spanish poet, of course, is one of the, a very important proponent of Andalusismo, and he was very much in dialogue with Benumaya, who was a fascist, and Lorca, who was someone who was killed by fascist militias in Grenada back in 1936. And so you had people on both sides of this, like politically, opposing sides during the period of the Civil War. There were probably as many Andalusistas associated with Franquismo as there were who were killed by it. Um, so it's not just sort of reducible to a political prescription that way, but you find that they shared this commitment that a kind of Andalusista political imaginary, a kind of that is an imaginary of a world that has its foundational moment in Al-Andalus and remains a kind of Hispano-Arabic civilizational expanse, was the standpoint from which the present need be assessed and responded to, even if some of those responses were quite different. So yes, I do think it made me think it's certainly an Orientalist tradition in many ways, including some of its what we could call its idealizations of the Orient, but they function not simply in the service of power, but the function actually of opening up a different sort of cartography for thought, for politics, for art, for music.
Yes, and as you explore in your book, this kind of geographical flexibility is so important in an era of kind of fortress Europe and rising Islamophobia. So lots of Andalusistas today in Granada are kind of pro-migrant activists who kind of embody this tradition in very politically timely ways. So I just wanted to jump into your chapters now. So just going to the third chapter, which explores the sonic traditions of Andalusia. So as you've already explained, Andalusismo, it's not just a kind of intellectual tradition stemming from post-enlightenment rationalism. It's also a kind of a series of cultivated ethics and sensibilities, which can kind of be cultivated over the course of someone's lifetime. It's a kind of way of being attuned to certain traditions, music, and culture. And so in chapter 3, you focus specifically on how the sonic traditions of Andalusismo create, and I quote, a transgressive historical space in Europe. So you suggest that flamenco music provides a sensory emotional opening, which generates an array of effective connections between medieval and Al-Andalus and contemporary Andalusia and North Africa. So just through your use of the concept fondo sonoro, I thought you could just explore Andalusismo's sonic relation to the past and the present.
Yes, I mean, one of the things that struck me immediately in sort of exploring this world was how important flamenco was for almost every Andalusista. From the late 19th century, you find that most of the participants contributing to this current all felt compelled to write about, think about, to explore flamenco. And often not only flamenco, but flamenco and its relation to musical traditions on the other side of the Mediterranean. So it was, you have many writings where people are going through just sort of like what seems to be a rather standard historical account of some period, and then, enter this sort of lyrical paragraphs about flamenco and as providing, as, where one hears these things in a kind of resonant, experientially rich fashion. So, I came to think of flamenco as a kind of medium through which the sort of, the passional dimension of this connection, both to the past and across the Mediterranean, let's say, came to be cultivated and felt by many people who belonged and forged this tradition. So a good part of the book, ended up being about this musical form, which, in the writings of different Andalusistas was elaborated and provided almost the kind of, the medium in which that history could be grasped. in which the sort of erasures of history could be overcome at the level of feeling, say. A feeling which then opened up the sort of possibility of recognizing a space, a historical continuity that would otherwise be unrecognizable. The concept of fondo sonoro was one that a musician who I met in Cordoba had used it to describe a kind of space of commonality where flamenco musicians encounter musicians trained in, he was speaking about Morocco's Andalusi tradition. In Morocco, there's a form of music often associated with sort of Sufi contexts that is a direct descendant, let's say, of the medieval musical forms developed in Al-Andalus. And so when musicians were interested in recuperating those medieval Iberian forms, they had to travel to Morocco, where one could find an actually existing tradition and learn from the Moroccans in some elements of a tradition, even though that tradition had evolved in Morocco in ways, but still it provided one of the existing avenues through which to recuperate that past. Which has the, which highlights in some way the way it was a certain kind of cross-Mediterranean sociality was a condition for the kind of recuperation and of that history. So, this musician was emphasizing that, this fondo sonoro, or this sonorous foundation, was beneath the surface level differences of these two traditions. This foundation provided the sort of possibilities of improvisation to take place. And he was describing the way in his meeting with Andalusi musicians that, after a while, they sort of found what he called this fondo this way. So I found the term useful both because of the significance of music for this tradition, but I also thought the term was relevant in relation to thinking about history, thinking about Andalusismo as a tradition, founded on the articulation of this space of commonalities, those binding Europe to the Middle East, and back to medieval Iberia, right? A space that allows the exploration of connections that cannot otherwise be recognized, let's say within the protocols of nationalist historiography. And the term also points, I think, usefully to the improvisatory dimension of Andalusismo as a kind of exploratory practice. I mean, Andalusistas find themselves, right? I describe it through this sort of idea of an ethics of disorientation. It's not that they simply find themselves as the inheritor of an identity. They find themselves confronting the fact that they're not quite the subjects of Catholic Spain that they had been told they were, that they find that they're inheritors of a tradition they can only partially grasp, that they can only partially accede to. And, in that, which is disorienting to the sort of concept of, the foundational concepts of identity, whether of Spanish or European or, and I see Andalusismo in some sense, not as simply a tradition that affirms a particular identity, but that navigates that condition of disorientation, and that is a response to the very disorientation, finding that one is actually in some ways part of an Islamic and Jewish civilization, and an exploration of what is the significance of that for the way one lives today. And that involves a kind of improvisation, I'd say, in which music is a very useful tool for thinking about it, both because of its improvisatory way of thinking about improvisation, and because of the sort of centrality of a kind of the non-discursive and the felt within musical practice, which also strikes me, Andalusismo, as these are key dimensions of it.
Thank you. That was fascinating response. And I think it's time to move on to questions. We've got about half an hour left. So either just write them in the chat or raise your hands, and we'll come to you. We've got a question from Justin Eckstein. Charles, would you like to read the question? It's just in the chat.
Sure. Okay. Yes. Whoops. How would you compare the sonic tradition to, say, Chiarivari in the more Eurocentric context? You know, I've read a little bit about Chiavari, but say a little bit more about it, Justin. I don't really know it that well. You have to unmute yourself, though.
Let me find Justin.
Oh, wow. I'm unmuted. My dog might go nuts, and I pre-apologize because he's just protecting the house.
My dog will go nuts if yours does, so I hope yours doesn't.
Whole chain reaction. I don't know. I was sort of struck by, I was thinking about what happened with the casseroles or the global circulation of this particular sonorous type, but it is often a reference back to a Renaissance period in which people would shake bells as a way of shaming and also joyously celebrating yeah, both, but right, like they did in the medieval times. But now we see it as a common protest tactic, whether it happened in South America, it's happened in Canada, when now all of a sudden we saw it with coronavirus, people then went out and started banging pots and pans to celebrate. So I was just sort of interested in if there's any relationship between this sort of sonorous space that's constructed by either of these configurations.
That's a fascinating question, particularly in relation, you're saying, to traditions of protest and
yeah,
right. You know, I don't immediately see that. It's a fascinating question, but I cannot say that I really, you know, have traced out the tradition in a way that allows me to sort of think, as I understand, like the musical traditions that are at the center of it, and it's also part of that. It's not just flamenco; it also involves a kind of recuperation of medieval, of an appreciation for medieval traditions, as well as for Middle Eastern traditions. And there's also a lot of kind of exploration in Spain across flamenco and Middle Eastern traditions. And I think that's a kind of, you know, that exploration itself is in some way an expression of Andalusismo, right? Of a certain sort of exploration of what it means to inherit something that one's not quite sure what it is, but one explores its potentiality nonetheless. And I see it working more at that level than as, you know, within traditions of protest per se.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Now we have a question from, sorry.
I see, Sasha, a question. I would also like to ask a question about Sufism, conversion to Islam, and religious identity. Okay, please.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed the talk, and I started reading the book this last week, and I've been enjoying it. And, you know, my own research looking at contemporary Sufism and sort of Jewish memories of Andalus, you run into kind of either people considering converting to Islam or, you know, taking on certain sort of Muslim adjacent practices like Sufism. And I know you talk a little about converts to Islam in Spain. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that and about the role of religion specifically.
Yes, Sufism is not Muslim adjacent, it's Islamic. But I realize that some forms of Sufism, including here in Berkeley, one wants to say that they're adjacent. But, you know, as many people have said, Sufism has actually, you know, been long central to, you know, classical Muslim education and so on. So it's not a, it's not strictly peripheral in that sense. So one of the, I mentioned this sort of, the one experience, let's say, that comes through in biographies of Andalusistas is the experience of what is it to inherit this complex inheritance, and the way in which it disorients one's identitarian attachments. Well, so, for some, that exploration has led to conversion. And for some people, Spain has one of the highest rates of conversions to Islam in Europe, and particularly in southern Spain. And I think one has to see that in part as resulting from a tradition of Andalusismo in ways. I think, just to give you a sense of the disorientation I'm talking about, when I was talking about Gil Ben Umayya, there's a letter that he sent in the middle of his career to one of the Moroccan nationalists, trying to explain why he supported their cause from someone who was understandably skeptical of why a Spaniard would support their ambitions for national autonomy. And in this letter, he says something like, well, I'm not Moroccan, but I'm a Muslim. And above all, I'm an Andalusian. In other words, an Arab. And I work for Spain because now it's part of the country where I reside. So those aren't the exact words, but it's something like that. But what's fascinating there is to think about, what these terms point to. Okay, in what sense was he a Muslim? I mean, it's not clear at all that he understood himself to be a Muslim. In what sense was he an Arab? It's, well, in a certain sort of historical imaginary, he could view himself as all of these things in some ways, right? As both an Arab, as a Spaniard, an Andalusian, a Muslim. And yet, none of those terms, if we think about those terms and the distinctions that they mark for us today, right? Instead, he's pointing to a much more ambivalent identity in which those articulate with each other in ways that are difficult to grasp and just sound confusing from the standpoint of the present. I mean, there's a very interesting, Gil Ben Umayya, one of his sort of, call it a political fantasy, was the idea of, he was always looking for the possibilities of political alliance that would be both enabling for Spain, right? Would, in its conditions of political weakness at the time, that would allow it certain sort of greater power and effectiveness within the world. And so he certainly imagined the possibility of Hispano-Arabic society, which meant a natural linkage between Spain and the societies on the other side of the Mediterranean, but also in the New World, because the New World being a Hispanic, forged very powerfully by Spanish colonialism. And he particularly highlighted the important role played by Arabs within Latin American political life, within Latin American society. And indeed, a good bit of his political activity had to do with reaching out to those figures in Latin America to try to build alliances, and to try to sort of, introduce them to the idea of a larger, that they, as part of an Andalusian world that embraced both Islam, Judaism, the New World, stretching almost all the way to India. Well, what was interesting is, of course, that sounds like a kind of political fantasy, but it's really a kind of, he saw it as a potentiality, as a potential embedded in the present that had its conditions of possibility in a sort of unrealized future of Al-Andalus. and he, his own life sort of attempted to realize that space through his forms of political activity, alliance, including commercial activities, because he set up various ventures with Moroccans. And what was fascinating is at the end, in 1945, when the Arab League was being established, his name was put forward to be the representative to the Arab League from Latin America. Now, he was neither an Arab nor a Latin American, and yet he could be seen from the standpoint of that association as both of those things, because in his own life bore witness to, right, a kind of space in which he could be seen as a legitimate representative to the Arab League, and as a representative of this broader, let's say, Hispano-Arabic world as it in Latin America. So what sounds like a sort of kind of fantasy, of course, could be recognized as more than fantasy from the standpoint of particularly the Arab intellectuals and political figures who were setting up that agency at the time. So I just point that to sort of highlight the kind of both the sort of instability of identities that I see as a key feature of this movement, but also the attempt to kind of create an alternative, call it historical geography, and to inhabit it and to accommodate one's life to it as a feature of Andalusismo. Okay, I see another question here.
I think we've also got one. Alejandro has been waiting.
Okay, Alejandro.
To speak, so I've unmuted him, and yes, he should be able to ask it now.
Please, Alejandro.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon from southern Spain. I'd like to say first that, as a historian and medievalist, I find the book extremely problematic and even concerning in many ways. I'd like to point to a couple of issues for the sake of brevity. First, what you basically do in the book is kind of endorsing and embracing an emotional approach to the past. In this case, through the example of Andalusismo. So my question here is, as a historian, I repeat, would you be willing to say admit similar emotional approaches to the past coming from, let's say, other kind of organizations or social or political tendencies like Andalusismo? Let's say, for example, far-right organizations having a strong emotional approach to a Christian medieval past, either in the US or worldwide, actually. That would be my first question about the role of emotional history. My second question is much more specific and has to do with something you say in page number 175, talking about Spanish scholarship and in particular Sesic historians, talking about ideas having to do with the origins of Al-Andalus. I quote, numerous authors have insinuated that despite González Ferrín's long-standing support for leftist causes, he is a phalangist in disguise. Much of the campaign against him, though not all by any means, has been waged by the Department of Jewish and Islamic Studies at CSIC in Madrid. Okay, fine, end quote. So I'm not, of course, a Sasic historian, but the truth, to tell you the truth, I find this claim extremely concerning, because this is a really serious charge. You know, I think accusing other colleagues of campaigning against another colleague. To my mind, this is something very serious. So my question here is, who are those numerous who accused González Ferrín as a phalange? Because I know, and I've quite a few about González Ferrín. I don't know of any Spanish historian branding González Ferrín as a fascist or a phalangist. Thank you.
Thank you, Alejandro. So in regard to your first question, right, the book is not meant to be an authorization of all histories that invoke emotion, as you know, or that let's say prioritize the passions in their approach to history. It's not simply a saying, all movements that are grounded in a passional stance to the past are necessarily good. Quite the contrary. There's no reason to think that at all. On the other hand, though, it's to say that one cannot either take the stance that, therefore, all approaches to the past that highlight the epistemic value of the emotions are necessarily dangerous or necessarily distorting, or that is, I mean, one example I give in the book, right, is to say that we'll think about, you know, debates in the United States about slavery, and think about the way in which the question about reparations for slavery, that it's really, those debates have to do with the kind of value that one places on that past and its significance for the present, and that is not something that can simply be assessed dispassionately, but it has to do with the way one responds in a passional sense to the significance of that past and its importance today. And so therefore, that's not just a question of like that enables one to get it right, but it enables one perhaps to recognize the significance of that past and our responsibility in relationship to it, right? And so in that sense, those debates are indeed have to do with necessarily rely on, we call it sensibilities, and right, the cultivation of sensibilities for the significance of slavery in the development of the United States. All of that is to say, therefore, is that one should not simply dismiss historical accounts because of their reliance, let's say, on emotionality. The idea that sort of dispassion serves a kind of policing function, right? That somehow, you know, protecting the present from the dangers of a certain kind of politics. Well, I mean, that in itself is to endorse a particular kind of politics and to disqualify others. And therefore, you know, the question is, I think that it's important, you know, the argument of the book is to say, well, one doesn't want to just disqualify all forms of political reflection simply because they do not abide by the sort of precept of dispassion at the heart of, let's say, the discipline of history. You know, as seems to me evident in the example of slavery in the United States, as a, you know, it's a very fraught and debate, and one with great significance in the present, and one that for which the sort of one cannot think of it outside, you know, the feelings one has for that significance. You know, in regard to the point you're making, about the line about that, You know, I think in the way I stated that there, you're right. There was a certain kind of, I should have said that there are individuals in the department, but the department itself certainly did not embrace any singular stance in regard to fitting. And, but nor was I saying there that when I did, while I did say, you know, by campaign, I meant criticisms, right, that some of the members of that department criticized Ferrin, but it was not to say that they were specifically those that accused him of you know, being a phalangist. But it was just to say that some of the more, you know, some of the more prominent critics of Ferrin, you know, were part of that department and and other parts of CESIC as well. So you're right, it was a little bit of a mistake to sound, it makes it sound in the way that it was written as if the department as a whole somehow was involved in a kind of critique. It should have said the individuals in the department, some individuals, but it's not about the department as a whole. But I appreciate you calling attention to that. So now there's a bunch of questions. Aidin, I can't speak, baby's sleeping, so I'll type my question. On the other end of Europe, in the Balkans, there have been similar debates about the Ottoman, often cast as Islamic past, and whether or when it is a part of modern or European identity of post-Ottoman Balkan nation states, particular music genres like Sevda in Bosnia or Rembetiko in Greece, provided ways similar to your discussion of flamenco in Spain. What is it about the sonic or auditory dimension that allows for these conversations and expressions to happen more easily and directly than, say, in newspapers or party platforms? Yes, could speak a bit more about why music allows these debates to emerge more clearly than elsewhere. You know, I think that it's not simply that music allows these debates, but a music, you know, engages us on something that's not translatable into language, and yet remains important to, in this case, the way we find ourselves connected to the past. I think, you know, I think in the book I invoke, you know, a recent discussion by Agamben about, who says, you know, that music is in some ways, you know, prior to any discourse. And he's talking about in Aristotle's view of music, that, you know, prior to any discourse, there's a fundamental sort of political organization that we're musically attuned to, because music sort of sets this sort of pre-discursive ground. And he talks about things like the trumpet in the, you know, in the going to battle, or the national anthem, or the sort of this kind of the way in which certain musics, right, engage people at a level that is not simply translatable into language, and that we often think of, like in the national anthem, as sort of, let's say, mobilized for ideological purposes. But the point of that is to say that we are powerfully moved and motivated and oriented by things like music, and that in itself should not simply be a kind of, you know, a kind of disturbance to our rationality, but a fundamental dimension of, you know, of human life, and including how we engage and find ourselves oriented to the past. And so, you know, I think that, you know, music has a much more important role than, we tend to think of it as an accompaniment, and really, you know, it's only discourse that sort of where we find what, you know, where actual truth takes place, let's say, and anything else is either an accompaniment or a distortion or a certain sort of something at the service of ideology. Well, of course, words are equally at the service of ideology and are equally distorting, we could say. And in that sense, music is, I I think plays a more, a powerful role in that, in shaping, the way in which we encounter things, and in this case, the way we encounter the past. In the book, I was, some of Wittgenstein's writings on music, I found very useful to think about this. Nina says, thanks very much for your insightful talk. Apologies, my mic's not working, but I had a question. What is it about today's Mediterranean that affords the rise and spread of the idea of a common Andalusian heritage? That Mediterranean has long been a site in which to sort of explore, right, a kind of, explore certain sort of heterogeneities, the sort of, the dissolution of certain kind of boundaries, the very way in which, the kind of solidity of the distinction between Europe and non-Europe, and that the Mediterranean with its, and particularly its, as a sea, as a liquid space, very much a space therefore of movement, of exchange, of fluidity, provides the kind of historical and imaginative resources to rethink what have seemed to be long-standing solidities, identities, histories. So, as a figure of mixture and a figure of fluidity, of the Mediterranean has, for a very long time been a site for reflecting on the sort of, and challenging, let's say, the stability of our forms of identity. And that goes back, for a very long ways. Let's see. Brian says, these are serious charges against fellow scholars. A critique is not a campaign, even if it is not the department as a whole, but individuals. That does not constitute a campaign. I agree, Brian. These are serious and unfounded charges. I'm not familiar with any such ad hominem accusation, any critique from González Ferrín or anyone else by individuals, and certainly not departments. There is an academic critique, for sure, but as you say, this is not a campaign. I think you're putting a lot of weight on, what a campaign is. A campaign can, can be all sorts of things. A campaign is not, a campaign can be launched by one or two people. There's no reason not to see that as a possibility, nor is it, campaign can simply be used as a metaphor for saying for making a sharp, for attempting to make a sharp critique. I don't see why that would be incompatible. I would also echo Brian's reiteration of Alejandro's comments. It seems to me that rereading, there's a lack of acknowledgement of intellectual diversity and really massive academic disagreements with scholars who can all consider themselves to be small Republicans. A campaign is coordinated. I think that the correct and honorable thing would be to walk back your comments. My comments are simply meant to mean that there are, that there's some of the more prominent critical voices that engaging González Ferrín's work were made by scholars working in CECIC. That does not seem to me to be incorrect in that way. Catherine Halls wants to ask a question. Catherine?
I'll just unmute her.
Hi, thanks very much, and thanks for this wonderful talk. It's been so interesting. My name is Catherine Halls, by the way. I'm one of the coordinators of the Jewish Muslim Research Network with Flora and Addy. We had a really wonderful event in December with Dalia Candiotti about her book, The Converso's Return, which was about conversos in conversos, sorry, I should pronounce it properly, in various world literatures. But her new project is about Jews availing themselves, or the descendants of Jews availing themselves of Spanish citizenship. And I think you mentioned that earlier, but I would love to hear how that fits into Andalusismo.
Yes. Yes, I had a conversation with Dalia about her work, and it really sounds fascinating. And there's a number of scholars who are working on this. Cam MacDonald has a book coming out on this as well. So I mean, in this book I focus primarily on Islam, but certainly there's at the same time much scholarship, much of Andalusismo also has to do with the importance of the Jewish inheritance, and that takes right. And so one finds a kind of philo-Semitic movement developing from early in the 20th century in Spain, that is not unlike the aspects of tradition around Islam that I have described. And today there is a conversion movement of people who have rediscovered that their Jewish roots, and have been encouraged to explore this dimension of their lives that they come to realize, or they come to feel, have been repressed and hidden from them. And part of that exploration, for some, that exploration is leading to a desire to convert, or to what they understand to return to Judaism, and so it's very similar to Islam. I mean, many of the people who convert to Islam understood themselves to be returning to a religion that was already a part of their lives, and that simply had been hidden from them in some ways. So it's that similar sense of kind of coming to find oneself coming to recognize, learning to recognize aspects of oneself that had been hidden, and finding ways to accommodate one's life so as to inhabit that new position one finds oneself to have inherited. So I find that fascinating, and yeah, there are all sorts of similarities. I see Maria has her hand up, and I would invite her, if we could invite her to.
So can you hear me, first of
Yes.
all? Well, thank you very much. Well, first of all, I have to apologize because I didn't get a copy of your book in time. So I'm just going to speak about what I heard other people saying, and on the basis of what you just said a little before. So I find it very disturbing what you said about the Department of Jewish and Islamic Studies in the Spanish High Council for Scientific Research. I myself work there. I am a researcher there. And I was just wondering, where does your statement come from? I'm trying to understand, because there could be, say, it's, first of all, how many members of that department do you know? It is 16 of us, Hebraists, Arabists, and most of us are actually philologists more than historians. And so I would like to know a little more. How on the basis of what are you making that statement about the scholarship in the physique?
Maria, we've been on this question for a while, and I would be glad to have a conversation with you individually on this, but really I don't think that this forum should just remain centrally focused on this one question. I realize that a number of you find that disturbing, and I would like to have a conversation with you to sort of speak about my reasoning in writing the way I have about that, but I just don't think that this space should be monopolized around that question. I'm happy if you want to sort of exchange, I'll be happy to sort of explain what led me to such a statement. And I recognize, of course, that it's, right, it's one that certainly deserves further elaboration, but I don't think this is, I don't want to simply dedicate this to that single question. So please write me and I will be glad to have a conversation about that.
Okay.
Okay, so I think we've run a little over time. It's been a great discussion. I can hear someone's dog going crazy. Thank you so much, Charles, for your time. I think everyone found that fascinating. We will post a link to purchase the book below in the chat. And yeah, I enjoyed it so much. Just to mention our upcoming events, in 2 days' time on the 4th, we've got a reading group looking at the work of Jacqueline Kahanoff and Albert Memmi. And then on the 17th of March, we've got a seminar on morning time and ascetic geographies of the South in a Mizrahi Seer's anti-biography. So we look forward to seeing you there. Well, thank you, everyone. And thank you so much, Charles.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thanks much to all of you.